Most of what I'm going to talk today is about the Renaissance and I guess Reformation that was involved with this rebirth of classical education. In other words, it's about you. It's about what you're doing. You're all part of something very, very important in our in our church, but even beyond that, in kind of the rebirth of education in this country. Now, the story I'm going to tell, I'm going to, because it's still happening, it's impossible. I mean, historians have the advantage of people being dead already, and you can tell what happened fairly objectively, and it's not changing on you all the time. So I'm going to be telling you the story, and I'll be leaving lots of elements out. There may be things that I don't get exactly right as far as dates and other associated things that a lot of you are involved with. Do let me know. And it's important that there be a record of this. But I'm going to talk about again you, and this was the picture made last summer's conference in Wyoming. Notice that this year's, when we took a picture, there's a lot more people involved. I mean, almost not twice as many, but almost twice as many. And that alone is emblematic of how our movement to bring back classical Lutheran education is really taking off on many different levels. But again, you are part of this, so pardon me while I talk about you as we go forward. Now, first, we should think about what happened to classical Lutheran education in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And many things are part of that. One development was the sense in the earlier part of the 20th century that the classical education formulated by Luther and Melanchthon, it's great, is really the best preparation for pastors. And so it started that this is how we'll train pastors, but not necessarily lay people in our parochial schools. But for pastors, the fathers of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod did lay out quite an impressive system. It was based on the gymnasium. Now, we're meeting in a gymnasium, I guess, and it's not just a place to play basketball. Okay, Melanchthon invented the 6-year high school. That would be that would be our equivalent. There's the grammar school for the lower level, but then for older children and for teenagers, he developed this institution called the gymnasium. It is a classical high school at a very high level. To this day, if you go to Germany, my wife had a school where she had an exchange program with she taught an inner city private Catholic high school, and they had an exchange program with a gymnasium in Germany. And we got to visit that and see it, and it was quite different than our typical high schools. And in Germany, students take a test, and as Germans do, they funnel you, and it's all very kind of controlled. But the very best and brightest students get to go to the gymnasium, where they're given a classical education. It doesn't last for 4 years, it lasts for 6 years, and then they go right into the university. Now, the LCMS brought over that institution, the gymnasium, and established it. The Concordias, what are now Concordia, campus of Concordia University, at Milwaukee, Bronxville, St. Paul, Portland, and Winfield, these were all 6-year classical academies, mostly for young men who wanted to go to seminary. And so, now the thing is, these were boarding schools. Think the opposite of homeschooling, okay? Instead of educating your children at home, you send them away from home a long ways, and they have to live on their own. I think that's kind of dysfunctional in many ways, but that was kind of the European model. You know, the British elite send their kids to this day to these elite boarding schools like you see on Harry Potter and everywhere else, only most of them without the magic instruction. But again, it was very classical, only it was for pastors only. And then in the system, they would go to the senior college. They had already the equivalent of 2 years of college by the American system, only actually far more than what they get in the American system. To call that a junior college is, wildly disproportionate. But then they would go to Fort Wayne. The campus at Fort Wayne was not originally a seminary, it was a classical school, a classical college, again, at a very high level. And again, they were studying, Latin and Greek and Hebrew and German and reading the philosophers and reading great literature and learning how to... and it turned out some really spectacular theologians and pastors. Now, one of them, I think it was Gilbert Meilander, who's still probably the most prominent Christian ethicist alive today, product of that system. And he said, hey, after I left seminary, I went to Yale, I went to this place, and these big Ivy League schools in his career. And he said, I never saw any kind of education that was close to what I got at that senior college at Fort Wayne, and in the preparation he got at the gymnasium. So that time, we were doing it really well. There's some problems I'll talk about. But for lay people, it was decided that they needed an American education. Again, the German immigrants who founded the LCMS, it began as an immigrant church, like other immigrant groups. Well, actually, unlike some immigrant groups, their interest was assimilating into American culture. And the Germans were very big on that, and they're very successful at it, and that's to their great credit. But again, that meant that they lost some things, I think. But to give an American education for lay people, to be sure, a Christian education, a Lutheran education, catechesis. And so parochial schools were almost universal at one time. But they started to get away from the classical approach. They were still giving to their pastors. Now, with Dewey, I kind of rushed past him. Again, remember in higher education, it was at that time, because of the influence of the German University Research University established by the King of Prussia, King Friedrich Wilhelm III, and his associate, the mind behind it, one of the major ones was Friedrich Schleiermacher, the father of liberal theology. Again, everything to be studied had to be approached scientifically. Everything had to be a science. And education was seen as a science. That is the preparation of teachers. The thought was education must be turned into a science. And so there must be a science of education. And if we just know enough psychology, just know enough about child development, do experiments on how children learn, we can turn this into a science, and teachers will have just a cut and dried method to follow, and we can teach children everything they need to serve the industrial economy, basically. It tended to become a servile approach to education because the liberal arts were seen as old-fashioned and non-scientific. Anyway, so you had the rise, because of Dewey, who turned this into a science, the institution of the Teachers' College. These were called normal schools. Normal, not in the sense of being, ordinary and fitting, but because they were trying to create norms for education, Again, the mentality then was to kind of have a one way that fits everybody, and it just turns out in a predictable way, just like the scientific experiments are very predictable. You put two chemicals together and they react in a way. It was thought if you put a teacher and a student together, if you just had the right scientific approach, you would get a certain, normal reactions. Because human beings are not chemicals, and human beings never quite obey. And we're seeing how so much of the education research that comes out and the psychological research can't be replicated. In other words, when they do a test with one group of people, they get one result, but if they get a different test set of people that they're working on, they get other results. Of course they do. Human beings have agency. Human beings are complicated. Human beings have wills. And anyway, but the LCMS saw what was going on in American higher education, and so they started normal schools, as they were called, for teacher training. And the Concordias at Seward and River Forest were focusing on training teachers for our synodical schools. Again, I didn't mean to create a negative context for those. Again, these are fine institutions and did some great work and never lost hold of their Christian identity as a whole. I expect a number of you are graduates of them. I'm just telling you what happened and why the Concordias were organized the way they were. Again, you have the gymnasiums, and you have the teacher colleges. Again, neither were classical in their structure. The Concordias were classical in the structure, but again, normally the classical mindset would want to give this to everybody, not just to pastors, but you start to see kind of loss. Now, this is what we were told when we enrolled our children in Lutheran school. I think it's about a direct quote. It said, "We provide an education just like the public schools, but we add Christianity." And the idea is that at the time, public schools in America were doing pretty well. They were not bad. They were still drawing, I think, on the general classical heritage, even though on the fringes, new experimental approaches, and in the teacher colleges, new ideologies were coming in. But most public schools were doing a pretty good job of teaching, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and a lot more than that. And so a Lutheran schools or parochial schools could say, yeah, oh, you'll get your child will get just as good an education as at the public schools. We're doing just the same way, but in addition to that, we add Christianity. Okay, the problem, though, is the public schools and progressive education started going to more and more extremes, and things were being done that just didn't work. And so you started to have books like these, in the 60s, Why Johnny Can't Read. And this book's still very interesting to read the specs, because it shows that the methods dreamed up by the progressive educators in the normal schools, you might try to make education as science, were just not teaching kids how to read. And that was followed by a lot of books. Why Johnny Can't Write. Why Johnny Can't Add. Another really good one was Why Johnny Can't Tell Right from Wrong. And again, poor Johnny was not doing very well. And so, and then added to that, the sense that many parents had that they have a crisis in their education, but because it's just not doing what it claims to be doing or is supposed to be doing. You had, the dominance of evolution, often turning explicitly against the Christian teachings that parents are trying to instill to their kids, not just biology, but on all these other levels. More recently, Heather Has Two Mommies, the homosexual agenda, and we have to teach this in our public schools too. And then you had radical politics, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, a Marxist, an avowedly Marxist left-wing interpretation of American history about how oppressive America is and how bad America is, and on and on and on. And yeah, some of these things happen, but again, it's filtered in the very, very Marxist, even communist approach. And again, a lot of parents, a lot of Christians, seeing that this is what their kids are really troubled. And so you had educational reform movements, people trying to come up with alternative curricula that would address some of these. You had the Back to Basics movement. A lot of these were done in some public schools. We'll just teach the basics. And also, new Christian schools were opening to give an alternative. Again, Lutheran parochial schools have been operating, all this time for hundreds of years, but now other evangelicals and Reformed and others were opening alternative schools, and homeschooling became a big, very important movement. And again, a lot of the homeschoolers, their agenda is to protect their children from, some of the bad influences, and to provide a Christian education, but also some just want better academics than what would be available in a typical school. And as these were happening, curriculum was being developed and a lot of alternatives, and a lot of things were tried, and sometimes with great success. And then there was an essay written by Dorothy L. Sayers back in the 40s, The Lost Tools of Learning. Dorothy Sayers was a British woman, friend of C.S. Lewis. In many ways, she reminds me of sort of a female C.S. Lewis. She has works of apologetics. They're just outstanding. They're much like Lewis, very insightful, very clear, writing with wit and humor, and really defending Christianity in a very engaging way. If you haven't read her apologetic work, you really need to. But she also wrote probably the best books on Dante that I've ever read. Literary critic. She writes the Lord Peter Wimsey mystery stories, really fun mysteries. And anyway, she's a great writer and thinker and an important figure. But in this essay, she wrote about the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, as you know, and talked about these as different, corresponding to different stages of a child's development, and how that you can teach to those and with those to great effect. At the end of her essay, she says, of course, in this modern world, she was saying, wouldn't it be great if we kind of tried this today, but in this world, of course, we know this is never going to happen. And it ended on that kind of down note. But then Douglas Wilson came forth. He was is a Reformed pastor in Moscow, Idaho. And he decided to start a school, Logos School, following the principles laid out by Dorothy L. Sayers in that essay. And he started a school in 1981. He then wrote a book about the experience, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, in 1991, 10 years later. And that book sets out a lot of the principles of how he applied Dorothy L. Sayers' books. And also there are other things, because he was exploring other aspects of classical education. He started Logos Press, which started publishing material and curriculum to support this kind of approach. For example, a very rigorous logic curriculum, how to teach logic and Latin and other things. He went on to start the Association of Classical Christian Schools in 1994. And this is because other schools started to follow his model. And a lot of Christian schools became members of the Association of Classical Christian Schools, and it's turned into a huge organization with hundreds and hundreds of schools, big conventions that's held, and he kind of introduced this classical Christian education back into, especially for Christians. Yeah, but how did this come into Lutheran rediscovery of classical education? Okay, this is a story primarily of two individuals. One is Reverend William Heine, who died just a few years ago. Melinda, his wife, his daughter is here. She's here, and Melinda's a great classical educator too. And anyway, but here's what Bill did. He was a pastor at Our Savior, Pagosa Springs, Colorado. Now, is anybody from Pagosa Springs now? Okay, well, the school, I think, started and kind of faded, but they brought it back, and they're working on accreditation with CCLE. But that was one of the first Lutheran schools to use classical education again. It was modeled after Logos School. And I believe, and again, Melinda, you may want to correct me on some of this history, he started it in 1992. He went to Moscow, Idaho. He observed the classes there. He became, he became acquainted very well with Doug Wilson. And he turned that his church's school in the classical direction. Now later, he became educational executive for the Wyoming district. And he brought classical education to, I think, all of the schools in the Wyoming district, which really was a catalyst to make lots of other things happen. Then he became headmaster of a Memorial Lutheran school in Houston. And again, his influence was in Texas. And so he is one of the real fathers of our movement here. You remember that day? This is 1992. Also, the other father is Reverend Robert Shibley. He, I think independently from what Bill Heine was doing in Colorado, he started a school also in 1992, the very same year. I don't know which one came first. I don't know which school year started first. I don't know who to give the credit, so we'll give credit to both of them. And I think that in many ways, his approach was different than the Doug Wilson approach. He, from what I heard, was studying Catholic models of education. Now, by the way, Zion Lutheran School is in Fort Wayne. He had been studying Roman Catholic schools. Now, Catholic schools, also have their issues with progressive education and becoming, liberal and all these other things. But to their credit, a lot of the Catholic schools have kept alive classical education in ways that a lot of people had sort of forgotten. And you can still find it there. In fact, I read an article just recently on, why all the Supreme Court justices, they're all Catholic, except for the ones who are Jewish. There are no Protestant Supreme Court justices. And the new one that's been nominated, he's Catholic too. And what is it about Catholics? And this article said, well, it's really because just about all of the Catholic justices had a Jesuit education. And Jesuits, as we know, are really good about teaching, giving a really good education, teaching their students to really think and to analyze and to express themselves well. And so naturally, students with a Jesuit education are going to rise to the top of their profession. Well, the Jesuits modeled their curriculum after that of Philip Melanchthon to the Lutheran schools. And the Reformation, again, we talked about the Reformation impact on education, and the Catholics before that, they weren't doing hardly anything about educating, ordinary people. And so with the Counter-Reformation, there's the movement to bring education back. So then the Catholics started opening their schools, and the Jesuits, whose main purpose was to put down, Lutheranism, they had their schools to give a Catholic education. But anyway, they followed Melanchthon's curriculum. And it's interesting to me, and I think that's very telling, that point about Jesuit education and why the Supreme Court has so much of that. Again, see, our students can be that way. Our students can rise to the top of their fields, whatever it is. If they're better educated than their peers, of course they will. How could they not? And we're seeing in everything from test results to the performance of students, and of course they will. Maybe we'll have dominant Lutheran Supreme Court justices in the next 100 years. Who knows? But anyway, and I think it's really neat that as Lutherans, we can draw on both the Reformed heritage that represented in Doug Wilson and this Catholic heritage that Pastor Shibley is bringing in, and they really have something very, very, very special. Now, Bob Shibley did other things. Zion is a Concordia Theological Seminary. Yeah, I guess I should say that, well, I think I'll talk about this a little bit later. The system changed, and part of it, the higher education system changed. The Seminex walkout, the controversy of the narrative scripture, Missouri Synod kind of exploded, and some of the liberals, I think that the German university method had contaminated, frankly, the Concordia system, the senior college and others. You look at some of the big figures, Martin Marty and Yaroslav Pelikan. They did incredible things scholastically, but they tended to be on the liberal side. And so after that blow up, the schools were reorganized to follow American system. So all of the schools became basically, they called them liberal arts colleges. I'll say some more things about what happened to liberal arts in colleges tomorrow. But anyway, at this time, the senior college would turn into the seminary. And so a lot of seminarians sent their kids to Zion, and the word started to get out. By the way, another Bob Shibley is actually here today at this conference. Is he here in the? Okay, he's very ill. He has health problems, and so he's not able to come to much of this. But watch for him, because he is the father of our movement. He's also the father of Erica Mildred. Another of his great contributions to classical education was having Erica, who his daughter serves on the board. She's our treasurer. She is the organizer of this conference, and she's done so much in her work as treasurer to really professionalize the CCLE in a way that it hadn't been before. So that's another of his great influences. So we're grateful for that. Another key figure brought in really by Pastor Shibley is Joe Brandos. He was the headmaster of Zion Academy. And what Joe did was to really Lutheranize classical education. Again, taking the Doug Wilson approach, which is Doug Wilson is a very conservative Calvinist. Again, great material there, but the Calvinism is sort of part of the hidden curriculum that's heard by one of the sessions. And so it needed to be Lutheranized, and also the Catholic traditions. And Joel did a lot of research and looking back at the history and really bringing back the kinds of things that we were talking about last time about what our heritage really is, what Luther said, what Melanchthon did, what Bugenhagen did. He started the Sturm list where Lutheran educators could discuss educational issues online. He was the real founder of CCLE. Again, a very important figure. But again, bringing these strains, there's the Reformed version, there's a Catholic version. Let's recover the Lutheran version, which has many elements in common with both of those. We can learn from both of them. But at the same time, we have things to contribute in our theology of law and gospel, our theology of vocation, our theology of the two kingdoms is a way to solve a lot of the problems that educators, especially in these other traditions, will struggle with. We have so much we can offer ourselves. Now, another figure, not directly, but as the others, but he was important and became even more important. Matt Harrison. Pastor Shibley left for Colorado to start the classical Lutheran high school at Colorado Springs, Shepherd of the Spring, with Dr. Steve Hine, who's another early thinker and educator who we owe a lot to. So when he left, the new pastor was a pastor named Matthew Harrison. And he continued Zion. He continued the school. He continued to work with Joe Brandos. And he would become an important ally when he got elected synodical president not that long ago. So we need to keep it in mind and realize the president of the synod was an early pioneer of classical education. In 1999, this organization was founded, Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education, 1999, 7 years after those two schools were started. And again, other schools started to also follow this approach. First conference is in Glen Eyrie, Colorado. Anybody attend that? Yeah, isn't it something? You remember how many people were there? Like 20 or so. Yeah. Really get to see what this has turned into is really remarkable. And again, this brought together a lot of people interested in classical Lutheran education and became an outpost for a lot of others to join in. But at the beginning, there was a lot of conflict with the synod, especially with the synodical schools. You get questions like this. Are you saying there's something wrong with our Lutheran schools? Well, okay, we kind of are. But again, that's not a message that put people on the defensive, just proposing an alternative, a different way of doing things. It could have been anything, but it created resistance in the kind of synodical educational establishment. And, you can see why. And frankly, I think sometimes we were maybe more aggressive than maybe was diplomatic, put it that way. Again, the other, are you saying there's something wrong with the way I teach? Are you saying there's something wrong with our Concordias teacher education programs? And again, we've got a lot of resistance from the universities, from the Concordia teaching programs. They did not want to accept what we were doing. They did not want to turn out teachers for our schools. They insisted on giving the progressive approach. That was what they taught. There are books. There's a book published by CPH on the history of Lutheran education that says nothing about classical education. It's all kind of the history of progressive education in the Missouri Synod. So this was something that was a real issue in the early days of classical Lutheran education. But gradually, things started to change. The key figure, I think, was William Cochrane. He was the head of the Lutheran Synodical school system, director of school ministries. He visited one of our classical schools. He visited Mount Hope in Casper, Wyoming. Anybody from there? Who's the teacher that he saw?
Betty Garwood.
Yeah, Betty Garwood. Betty Garwood. Is she here by any? Yeah, but she was just a great teacher, and this was a really good school. And Bill Cochrane attended it, and he was blown away by seeing what these young children were able to do, what they were able to, the ideas they were coming up with, the high level of academic performance, the spirit in that class. And he became a believer in what we were doing. Now, again, he's still administering the regular schools, but he appreciated classical education, and he became a very early and very key supporter because he saw it in action, and he was so impressed with what, school just like yours, what they're doing. So he was important in the growing acceptance. And then other things, Cheryl Swope, who's here, she wrote this book, Simply Classical, applying classical education to special needs children. And I mean, that's an important contribution. Her book was published by the Society for Classical Learning. Again, as Douglas Wilson's ACCS was going on, other Christian organizations, maybe that weren't so Calvinist, started. The Society for Classical Learning was one of them. Well, Memoria Press, I should say, was published by Memoria Press, who works with it as CL. Anyway, they're getting more and more better material. They published her book. They're using her insights and contribution to make a whole curriculum for special needs children that is classical. You can see it here. Memoria Press has a booth here, and you can see all of that curriculum. Look through the Simply Classical material. But one of the things that did was to make us Lutheran educators interact with the bigger classical Christian school movement in a very important way. But also, I think her book was important. A lot of people think classical education is elitist, and it's too hard, and it's too academic and too strict, and it takes all the fun out of so wrong, so wrong. But her book showed just how humane classical approach is, how human, how it honors the students that might not have the same academic ability that you might think, how this is so liberating. Again, liberal arts. Classical education, if it's done right, is liberating. And if you're not finding it liberating, you don't quite understand it yet. But her book is really, very important, and I think this has contributed to the acceptance of what we're doing. Again, Matt Harrison getting elected president, and then he brought in Bart Day. At the time, he was the head of, in effect, of the mission work here, including the schools. He was a headmaster at, where's that, Memorial? Yeah. And so we have two most powerful figures, leaders in our church body were committed to classical education, and that helped. But that wasn't all. Scholarship. Tom Korchak, who was just up here talking, he wrote, again, a professor at Concordia, Chicago, again, a key center for teaching or education. It was one of the teacher colleges. To this day, it's sort of been the center of things. He wrote this book, published by CPH, Lutheran Education. Again, and I cited that on my first talk about how Lutheran education is classical education plus catechesis. And he said that this is what our heritage is. And I think that's an important key to acceptance, to show the scholarly world, to show the Concordias that this is not some strange cult. This is Lutheran education, what we're doing here. And again, he joined the faculty at Concordia, Chicago, and he's still very active. He started the CALA organization, and this is going to be really helpful in, well, this next part, Key to Acceptance. Concordias training classical teachers. And I'm proud to say Concordia University, Wisconsin, where I used to teach, has started doing this. Concordia University, Chicago, Dr. Korchak, it's doing this. Concordia Irvine is starting to do this. And as they're developing, and there may be others, I'm not sure what might be happening on some of the other Concordias. But what a blessing that is to have our Concordias training, teaching, educating teachers for our classical schools. And that's a huge, huge development in the acceptance of our program in the Synod, but also in making it more and more effective. The 2016 Synodical Convention, the whole Synod passed 2 resolutions commending classical education, classical Lutheran education, and encouraging its acceptance. We won't read these, but what a milestone for us. And the National Lutheran School Association. This is the biggest one, I think. That's a picture of Dr. Jacqueline Veith. The Dr. Veith, who in many ways I think is more consequential for this movement than this Dr. Veith. She has expertise in accreditation, and she worked with the board to put together a plan for accreditation of our schools. I mean, any school can say, oh, we're classical, or we're Lutheran. Well, how Lutheran are they? How classical are they? And it became evident that we need some standards and benchmarks and help in knowing, for schools to know what they need to be doing to really be doing that. But Jackie developed this with the board, and she implements it, and she's been accrediting our school, that many of you know and have worked with her, implementing their accreditation standards. But our accreditation has been accepted by the NLSA, National Lutheran School Association. This is the accreditor of all Lutheran schools. And if NLSA accredits a school, they have an agreement with the regionals, Sachs, North Central, all the others, so that they get regional accreditation. And so Lutheran schools always want to be accredited by NLSA because that shows their parents and the public this is a really good school, and that gets the regional accreditors, the secular accreditors accept that, and it's a real landmark. But NLSA now accepts CCLE accreditation in the same terms. So our schools that get CCLE accreditation, and again, Jackie and team of people go and study the school, and if you get accreditation, they also get NLSA accreditation, which means they also get the regional accreditation. And that is so huge for our schools, and in the quality of what we're doing and recognition for it and all the benefits that come from that. And I think what that indicates is we have found now acceptance. Acceptance in the Synod, in our schools, in our parochial schools, in our universities, in the synod as a whole, acting in convention. Now we're accepted in the Lutheran school world, and we're accepted even in the secular arena by virtue of the assessment data we can show, performance of our kids, the excellence of our schools. So now we're a living and growing and developing movement. And there's a lot to it. And the more we learn, the more there is to learn. And we're still discovering elements of what a classical education can be and what we need to do to implement it better. We'll talk about that tomorrow.